The sound of shattering glass was not the only thing that tore through the silence of the Grand Meridian Ballroom. My ex-husband invited me here to mock me, believing I was nothing but a broken memory. He had no idea I arrived with 2 perfect replicas of him and a file that would torch his billion-dollar empire in just one night. The look on his face is about to crumble faster than the champagne flute on the floor. My name is Alara Vance. I stood before the towering mahogany doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel in New York and forced oxygen into my lungs until the frantic rhythm of my heart slowed to a steady, predatory beat. Inside those doors, the air was undoubtedly thick with the scent of expensive champagne, heavy perfumes, and the ozone smell of unbridled ego. It was the 10th anniversary gala of Vanguard Innovations, a night designed to celebrate the brilliance of the tech world, but mostly designed to stroke the vanity of one man. I smoothed the fabric of my dress. It was a custom piece, a shade of crimson so deep it looked like fresh arterial blood under the streetlights. It was a violent, unapologetic color. Julian Thorne, my ex-husband, had spent the last 4 years painting a very specific picture of me for the media. To the world, I was the crazy ex-wife, the tattered woman who cracked under pressure, the bitter leech who could not handle his genius. I was supposed to be broken. I was supposed to be invisible. But tonight, I was not wearing the rags of a victim. I was draped in silk that cost more than the average American car, and every inch of me screamed that I was not merely surviving, but thriving. My fingers tightened around the invitation in my hand before I slipped it into my clutch. I could still see his handwriting, that sharp, arrogant scrawl that used to make me feel safe, but now only made my stomach turn. "Come see what you lost." He had written, it was not an invitation. It was a summons to a public execution. He wanted me here to be the contrast to his shining new life. He wanted the board of directors and the hungry press to look at his glittering new fiancée and then look at me, the washed-up past, and nod in understanding. He wanted to humiliate me one last time to secure his narrative before the merger. I signaled the doorman. He pulled the heavy door open, and the noise of the party spilled out like a physical wave. I stepped into the light. The effect was instantaneous. It started with the people nearest the entrance, a hush that spread outward like ripples in a pond until the entire ballroom fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. The string quartet faltered for a beat before recovering. I kept my chin high, walking with a slow, deliberate cadence that I had practiced in front of my mirror for weeks. "Is that—" a woman in a silver gown whispered loud enough for me to hear. Her companion, a man I recognized as a tech journalist who had once written a hit piece on me, adjusted his glasses nervously. "It can't be." Julian said she was unwell. "She looks dangerous," someone else muttered. I let their whispers wash over me. My eyes locked on the stage at the far end of the room. There they were. Julian stood under the spotlight, looking every inch the king of his own making. Beside him stood Sienna Blair, his former secretary and the current vice president of Vanguard. She was clinging to his arm with a possessiveness that looked desperate to the trained eye. They were looking down at the crowd with triumphant smiles, raising their glasses in a toast to their own greatness. When Julian saw me, his smile froze. It did not drop, for he was too much of a showman for that. But the corners of his mouth tightened. I knew that look. I had spent 6 years studying that face. He was terrified. He was sweating behind that Italian suit because Vanguard's stock was volatile, and he needed this merger to go through to cover the massive holes in the financial reports. He needed to look like a winner, and my presence was a variable he had not calculated correctly. I shifted my clutch from one hand to the other. Inside the velvet lining sat a small, modified transmitter capable of overriding the venue's audio frequency. It was a simple trick, really, for someone who actually built the technology Vanguard was famous for. But that was just a tool. My real weapon was not in my hand. Waiting in the VIP guest suite down the hall, guarded by a trusted nanny, were two 4-year-old children, Leo and Mira. They had been told to wait for the special music. They were the perfect, undeniable copies of the man standing on the stage. Julian thought he had buried his past, but I had brought it back to life, breathing and walking. I stopped in the dead center of the ballroom. The crowd parted around me, giving me a wide berth as if I were radioactive. I looked up at the stage, meeting Julian's gaze with a cold, hollow stare that promised nothing but total devastation. Tonight, I thought, letting a small, cruel smile touch my lips. This stage is mine. The applause in the ballroom felt distant, drowned out by the phantom sound of rain hitting the metal roof of a garage 6 years ago. That was where Vanguard Innovations truly began, not in this gilded hall with crystal chandeliers, but in a cramped, drafty space that smelled of soldering iron smoke and stale coffee. Back then, I was the engine, and Julian was the paint job. I spent 18 hours a day writing the code that would eventually revolutionize data compression, while Julian spent his time charming investors and practicing his handshake in the mirror. We were happy, or so I desperately wanted to believe. I remember nights when I would fall asleep on the keyboard, exhausted, and Julian would wrap a blanket around my shoulders, you and me against the world. Ilara, he would whisper against my ear, we are a team. I build the empire. You build the throne. It was a beautiful line. I did not realize then that he never intended for me to sit on that throne. The erasure was subtle at first, like the slow erosion of a coastline. It started with the paperwork. He would bring me stacks of legal documents late at night when my eyes were blurry from coding. Just standard liability forms. Babe, he would say with a dismissive wave of his hand. Trust me. You focus on the tech. Let me handle the boring suits. I trusted him. I signed away my voting rights, my intellectual property claims, and my future, one signature at a time. Then came Sienna. She was 22, fresh out of business school, with ambition that burned brighter than her intellect. Julian hired her as an intern, but within 3 months, she was his executive assistant. He called her a dynamic new element essential for the company's image. She just understands the market. Ilara. Julian told me once when I complained about Sienna rearranging my workstation, you are too valuable to be wasting time on scheduling. Let her help. The help turned into long business trips. First, it was a weekend in Chicago, then a week in London. I stayed behind, frantically patching critical bugs in the system that were causing the servers to crash, while Julian and Sienna uploaded photos of expensive dinners. I remember finding a credit card statement one afternoon. There was a charge for a diamond bracelet worth $5,000. My heart had leaped, thinking it was a surprise for our 5th anniversary. When the date came and went with only a generic card and a drugstore bouquet, I told myself he was just stressed. I told myself the charge was for a client gift. I was so busy trying to start a family, taking vitamins and tracking ovulation cycles, that I did not see the knife until it was buried in my back. The end came on a Tuesday. It was pouring rain, a torrential downpour that battered the windows of our apartment. I had just prepared a presentation on expanding our server capacity, excited to share my vision. Julian walked in, shaking his wet umbrella. He did not kiss me hello. He tossed a manila envelope onto the coffee table. What is this? I asked, reaching for it. It's a restraining order, Julian said, his voice devoid of any warmth. And divorce papers. I laughed. It was a reflexive, confused sound. Julian, what are you talking about? Is this a joke? The board voted this morning. Ilara, he said, pouring himself a drink without looking at me. You are out. Fired. We found evidence of gross negligence and security violations on your laptop. You were selling our code to competitors. That's a lie. I screamed, the air leaving my lungs. I wrote that code. Every single line. Julian finally looked at me then. His eyes were not the eyes of the man I loved. They were the eyes of a stranger who viewed me as a liability to be liquidated. Sienna stepped out from the hallway, wearing one of my silk robes, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "It doesn't matter what is true." "Ilara," Julian said, taking a sip of his scotch. "It matters what we can prove. And right now, you look like a hysterical, incompetent saboteur. If you try to fight this, I will bury you in so many lawsuits you won't be able to afford a cup of coffee." He walked over to the door and held it open. The wind howled outside. "Get out," he said softly. "You simply don't fit the future of Vanguard anymore. I need someone who can stand beside me in the spotlight, not a housewife playing engineer." I walked out into the rain with nothing but the clothes on my back, while the man I had built a life with locked the door behind me. That was the night Ilara the wife died, and the woman standing in the ballroom tonight was born. The descent was not a slide. It was a free fall. Within 48 hours of being thrown out into the rain, I learned that Julian had not just fired me, he had erased me. I stood at the grocery store checkout, trying to buy bread and milk, only to watch the cashier cut my credit card in half. "I am sorry, ma'am," she said, popping her gum. "Bank says it is reported stolen." I walked out with nothing. My personal accounts were frozen, tied up in pending litigation regarding the intellectual property theft Julian had fabricated. I checked the news on my cracked phone screen and saw my face plastered across every tech blog. The headlines were vicious. "The Mad Queen of Vanguard. How Ilara Vance faked her way to the top." They called me unstable. They called me a gold digger who had leached off Julian's brilliance. He had released doctored emails where I supposedly ranted about wanting to ruin the company. I retreated to the only place I could afford, a studio apartment in the far reaches of the suburbs that smelled of mildew and despair. The heating was broken, and the neighbors screamed at each other through paper-thin walls until 3 in the morning. I survived on a small stash of cash I had hidden in an old hollowed-out book years ago, counting every penny like a miser. 2 weeks later, the sickness started. I thought it was stress at first, the bile rising in my throat every time I looked at my bank balance. But then I fainted in the bathroom. The clinic doctor was a tired woman with kind eyes who did not recognize me from the tabloids. "Congratulations, Mrs. Vance," she said, pointing to the grainy monitor. "Or should I say, double congratulations. There are 2 heartbeats." "2," I whispered, gripping the paper gown. I can't afford one. How can there be 2?" I walked home in a daze. Twins. Julian's children. A part of me, the stupid, sentimental part that still bled, wanted to reach out. Surely he would care about this. Surely a man could not hate the mother of his children. I sat on the stained mattress and dialed his number. My thumb hovered over the call button. Just then, the small television in the corner flashed to a breaking news segment. It was Julian. He was sitting on a white sofa, holding hands with Sienna. The Chiron read, "Vanguard CEO announces engagement." "Julian," the interviewer asked, "how does this relationship differ from your previous marriage?" Julian looked directly into the camera, his eyes devoid of any remorse. "Honestly, it feels like I can finally breathe. My ex-wife was a burden. She was an anchor dragging down the ship of my potential. She never understood the vision. Sienna is different. She is the future. I am just glad to be free of that dead weight." The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor. He did not see a wife. He saw an obstacle. If I told him about the babies, one of 2 things would happen. He would either force me to get rid of them to protect his fresh start, or worse, he would drag me into court. He would paint me as an unfit mother, use his billions to buy a judge, and take my children away to use them as props for his reformed family man image. "No," I hissed into the empty room, wrapping my arms around my stomach. "You will never touch them. You will never even know they exist." That night, I destroyed my SIM card. I packed my meager belongings and moved again. This time under my grandmother's maiden name. I became a ghost. The next 7 months were a blur of nausea and coding. I could not show my face in the corporate world. So I went underground. I scoured the dark web and freelance forums, taking on complex coding jobs under the handle Nemesis. I wrote algorithms for overseas logistics companies and fixed security breaches for banks, all while vomiting into a bucket beside my desk. I slept 3 hours a night. I ate cheap noodles, but I saved. Every dollar went into a secure offshore account that Julian's forensic accountants could never find. The fear that had initially paralyzed me began to change. It hardened. The hot, chaotic rage that made me want to scream slowly cooled down into something solid and sharp. I was no longer a weeping wife mourning her marriage. I was a weapon being forged in the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sleep tight, Julian. I would whisper to the ceiling as the sun rose. Enjoy your kingdom while you can. Leo and Mira arrived with the force of a hurricane, screaming their way into the world and anchoring me back to reality. When the nurse placed them in my arms, small and fragile, the crushing weight of my depression did not vanish, but it shifted. It became something I could carry because I had to carry them. They were my reason to breathe. But as they grew, the universe played a cruel joke on me. They were carbon copies of Julian. By the time they were 2, the resemblance was undeniable. Leo had his father's stubborn set of the jaw, and Mira had his calculating, observant silence. But most devastating of all were their eyes. They both possessed the thorn eyes, a shade of stormy gray that looked like crushed granite. It was a color so specific, so rare, that anyone who knew Julian would recognize it in a heartbeat. "Why do I look different than the other kids?" Leo asked me once after preschool, pointing to his eyes. I smoothed his hair back, forcing a smile. "Because you are special, Leo. You have eyes that see everything." I made a vow then. I would not poison them with the bitterness that rotted in my gut. I taught them to be strong, to be independent, and to never apologize for their existence. When they asked about their father, I did not paint him as a monster. I told them the truth, or at least a version of it they could understand. I told them he was a man who got lost in his own ambition, a man who chose gold over love. While I raised them, I also raised myself from the ashes. For 4 years, I lived a double life. By day, I was the quiet single mother in the suburbs who baked cookies and attended parent-teacher meetings. By night, I was a phantom in the machine. I sat in the dark, the blue light of my monitors reflecting in my eyes, and I coded. I wrote a new compression algorithm, one that was lighter, faster, and more stable than the bloatware Vanguard was currently selling. I did not sell it under my name. I routed everything through 3 layers of shell companies. I sold the license to Vanguard's biggest competitors, chipping away at Julian's market share piece by piece. The money started to flow back in. First, it was a trickle, then a stream, and finally, a river. I moved us to a secure penthouse with high security. I bought clothes that made me feel like armor, and I hired Miller, the most expensive private investigator in the city. Miller was a man of few words and high results. He met me in a quiet park while the twins played on the swings. He handed me a thick dossier. "You were right," Miller said, lighting a cigarette. "He is cooking the books." I flipped through the pages. Julian was desperate. Vanguard was bleeding money because of my algorithm in the market. So he was faking growth numbers to court a merger with a massive international conglomerate. It was a deal worth $2 billion, his golden parachute. "Look at the merger requirements," Miller pointed out. I scanned the document. The acquiring company was old money, conservative and strict. They had a non-negotiable morality clause. The CEO had to be of sound moral character with no pending family litigation and no undisclosed heirs. My finger stopped on the disclosure form Julian had signed under penalty of perjury. Under the section for dependents, he had checked none. Under the section for marital history, he had noted divorced, ex-wife whereabouts unknown. "He lied," I whispered, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. "He erased us legally to close the deal. If they find out he has 2 secret children and a very present ex-wife, Miller said with a grim smile. The deal collapses. And since he signed this for the SEC, it is federal fraud. He would go to prison for 10 years. Minimum. I looked up at my children. Leo was pushing Mira on the swing, both of them laughing, their gray eyes sparkling in the sun. Julian had handed me the gun, loaded it, and placed the safety off. All I had to do was pull the trigger. He thinks we are gone, I said, closing the file with a snap. How he thinks I am still that broken girl in the rain. Miller, find out when the final signing is. It is at the 10th anniversary gala, Miller replied. Next Saturday. Good, I said, standing up and brushing the dust off my skirt. I think it is time for a family reunion. The notification blinked on a laptop I rarely touched anymore. It was an email to an old address, one I had not used since the divorce. The subject line read simply, Opportunity. It was classic Julian. He did not ask, he summoned. When I dialed the number included in the email, he answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for me to beg. Alara. His voice came through the speaker, smooth and dripping with condescension. I was not sure you were even alive. You have been hard to find. I have been busy surviving. Julian, I said, keeping my voice low and trembling slightly, playing the part he expected. Right. Surviving. Look, let's cut to the chase. I have a big night coming up. The 10th anniversary gala. It is important for the company image. I want you there. I paused for effect. Why would you want me there to show there are no hard feelings? He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. And to sign a document, a public waiver stating you have no claims against Vanguard or my estate. It is just a formality for the merger. In exchange, I will cut you a check for $10,000. Cash. Tonight, $10,000. He thought that was a fortune to me. He thought I was starving in a gutter, and he wanted to parade me in front of the cameras like a charity case. He wanted Sienna to shine next to my dull, defeated presence. He wanted the world to see that he had upgraded. $10,000 would really help me right now, I whispered, injecting a note of desperate gratitude into my tone. But, can I ask for one small thing? Make it quick. Alara, I have a fitting in 20 minutes. I want to say a few words. Just a short toast. To wish you and Sienna happiness. I want closure. Julian. He hesitated for a second, then chuckled. A toast from you, fine. Keep it under 2 minutes, and try not to cry on stage. It is pathetic. He hung up. I stared at the phone, my expression shifting from feigned weakness to stone-cold resolve. Oh, I won't cry. Julian. But you might. I went to the closet where I had hidden the garment bags. I had commissioned them months ago from a designer in Milan who thought he was making costumes for a royal photo shoot. I pulled out the outfits for the twins. For Leo, a miniature tuxedo tailored to perfection in midnight blue velvet. For Mira, a dress of silver silk that shimmered like moonlight on water. They were not dressed like commoners, they were dressed like heirs to a throne. As I helped them into their clothes, I checked the small silver clutch I would be carrying. Inside, nestled next to my lipstick, was a black USB drive. It contained 4 years of forensic accounting data proving Julian had been inflating revenue reports by 30%. But more importantly, it contained a PDF file of a DNA test. My private investigator, Miller, had managed to snag a few strands of hair from Julian's coat at a high-end dry cleaner 3 weeks ago. The match was 99.9%. I knelt down in front of Leo and Mira. They looked at me with those serious, storm-gray eyes that mirrored my own determination. Now remember, I said, straightening Leo's bow tie. What do we do when the doors open? We hold our heads up, Leo said, his voice steady. And we don't smile unless you smile. Mommy, Mira added. That is right, I said. Tonight is not just a party. Tonight, we are going to take back what is ours. I stood up and turned to the full-length mirror. The woman staring back was unrecognizable from the frantic, tear-stained wife who had been thrown out into the rain. I smoothed the crimson fabric of my gown. My hair was swept up in an intricate, severe style that highlighted the sharp angles of my face. My makeup was flawless, a mask of war paint. I was not Alara the victim. I was Nemesis. And I was ready to burn his world to the ground. Success is not just about what you build. It is about what you have the courage to leave behind. Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, smooth as velvet and just as artificial. He gripped the sides of the podium, leaning forward as if to embrace the adoration of the room. 10 years ago, Vanguard was just an idea, a spark. But sparks can be extinguished by damp wood. I had to make hard choices. I had to cut loose the anchors that were dragging this company into mediocrity. He paused for effect, looking down at Sienna. She gazed up at him with adoring eyes, her hand resting protectively on his arm. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. My ex-wife. Ilara, Julian continued, and a ripple of titters ran through the crowd, was a part of that early chapter, a difficult chapter. We all know the stories, the instability, the lack of vision, but I invited her here tonight not to gloat, but to show that we can all move on, to show that even the broken can be forgiven. Sienna sighed into her microphone, a soft sound that was meant to convey sympathy but dripped with condescension. We just want her to find peace, she said, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. Poor thing. The audience murmured their approval. They loved this narrative. The benevolent genius and his supportive partner, showing mercy to the crazy ex-wife. Ilara, Julian called out, scanning the back of the room where the shadows were deepest. I know you are back there. Come on up, join us. Let us show everyone that there are no hard feelings. He expected hesitation. He expected a woman in a cheap department store dress, shrinking away from the light, terrified of the judgment he had orchestrated. He expected me to be the punchline to his joke. I stepped into the center aisle. My heel struck the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, deliberate sound that cut through the murmurs. With every step, the rhythmic click echoed like a clock counting down to their destruction. I walked with the rhythm of a predator entering a clearing. The crimson silk of my dress caught the stage lights, blazing like a signal fire against the sea of black tuxedos and polite gray gowns. I did not look at the floor. I did not look at the guests who were gasping and nudging each other. I kept my eyes locked on Julian. The jazz band, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, trailed off into a confused silence. The saxophone player actually lowered his instrument. The room fell dead quiet, save for the rhythmic, commanding sound of my approach. I saw Julian's smile falter. It did not disappear, but it froze, the corners twitching as his brain tried to reconcile the image of the destitute woman he had created with the vision walking toward him. Sienna's hand dropped from his arm. Her eyes widened, taking in the custom fit of my gown, the diamonds at my throat, and the sheer, unadulterated power radiating from me. I reached the stairs to the stage and ascended them without breaking my stride. I stood before them, towering in my heels, and the silence in the room was deafening. Up close, I could see the sweat beading on Julian's upper lip. He smelled of fear and expensive cologne. He cleared his throat, desperate to regain control of the room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a white envelope, likely containing the check he had promised. I see you dressed up for the occasion, Julian said, his laugh sounding brittle and forced. He held the microphone out to me, but he did not let go of it immediately. You look surprisingly well. Ilara, did you spend the last of your savings on a rental? Do you need some taxi money to get home after this? The crowd chuckled nervously, unsure if they were still supposed to be laughing at me. I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. My fingers brushed his, and I felt him flinch. I turned to face the audience, letting the silence stretch for one heartbeat, then two. I do not need taxi money, Julian, I said, my voice clear and steady, resonating in every corner of the hall. I arrived here in a car you dream of but could never afford. The chuckle in the room died instantly. Julian's jaw tightened. But I did not come here to talk about cars. I continued, my gaze sweeping over the board of directors sitting in the front row. I came here to accept Julian's invitation to speak. He wanted a toast. He wanted closure. So, let us have it. I turned back to look Julian dead in the eye. I am going to tell you a story, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. It is not the story you read in the tabloids. It is a story titled The Truth Behind the Success of Vanguard. Julian stepped forward, reaching for the microphone. Alara, that is enough. I am just getting started, I said, and I pressed the button on the small remote concealed in my palm. The massive screen behind us, which had been displaying the Vanguard logo, flickered and went black. But it did not stay black for long. With a sharp hum of electricity that made the front row jump, it exploded into a complex web of timelines, code commits, and bank transfers. The bright white light from the screen washed over Julian's face, draining the last vestiges of color from his skin. You built a myth, Julian, I said, my voice projecting effortlessly over the stunned silence. You told the world that Vanguard was born from your genius. But let us look at the metadata. Shall we? I gestured to the screen where a timeline appeared. Every single patent, every line of the core compression code was committed from a server located in our home garage between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. And where were you during those hours? Julian. A split screen appeared. On the left were the timestamps of the code creation. On the right were Julian's geotagged social media posts and credit card charges. You were in Cabo. I narrated coldly. You were in Paris. You were buying champagne and diamond earrings for your dynamic new element. Sienna, using the initial seed money from our angel investors. The crowd gasped. It was not a polite gasp. It was the sound of a room full of sharks smelling blood. Documents flashed on the screen invoices for luxury suites at the Ritz-Carlton listed as server maintenance, and jewelry receipts categorized as office supplies. Turn it off. Julian screamed, his composure finally shattering. He waved frantically at the audio-visual booth. Cut the feed. Cut the power. Do it now. But the technicians in the booth were helpless. I saw them frantically typing on their keyboards, but my override algorithm had locked the system down tight. The only person who could stop this presentation was me, and I was just getting started. You cannot stop the truth. Julian, I said, just like you could not stop me from finding out about the merger. Sienna, realizing that her reputation was being incinerated in real time, made a fatal error. She lunged. She abandoned her poised executive facade and rushed toward me, her hand outstretched to grab the microphone. "Give me that, you lying witch!" she shrieked. I did not flinch. I simply took a half step to the left, a movement as fluid as water. Sienna, carried by the momentum of her own rage and the height of her stilettos, grasped at empty air. She crashed hard onto the polished wooden stage, her expensive gown bunching up around her knees in a tangled, undignified heap. A ripple of laughter tore through the room. It was cruel, it was spontaneous, and it was the sound of her social standing evaporating. She scrambled to sit up, her face twisted in humiliation, but the spotlight remained fixed on me. I turned my back on her and faced Julian again. He looked small now, stripped of his pretenses. "You stood on this stage 5 minutes ago and spoke about ethics," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "You told the shareholders that you are a man of family values. You signed a merger agreement with the Olympus Group, a contract worth $2 billion that explicitly states in Section 4, Clause B, that the CEO has no undisclosed heirs and no potential for future succession disputes." Julian's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. I don't know what you are talking about," he stammered, sweat dripping down his temple. "I have no heirs. I have no children. You know that, do I?" I asked softly. I turned toward the velvet curtains at the side of the stage. The darkness there was thick, but I knew who was waiting in the shadows. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers. "Come out," I commanded. The heavy curtains parted. A separate spotlight, bright and piercing, cut through the gloom and hit the floor. Two small figures stepped into the circle of light. Leo walked first, his chin held high, wearing his midnight blue tuxedo with an elegance that no 4-year-old should possess. Mira followed, her hand lightly gripping her brother's arm, her silver dress shimmering like a blade. They did not look scared. They looked like royalty reclaiming a usurped kingdom. They walked to the center of the stage and stood beside me. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the lungs of every guest. You did not need a DNA test to see the truth. It was written in the bone structure of their faces. It was etched into the stubborn set of their jaws. But mostly, it was screaming from their eyes. 3 pairs of identical storm gray eyes stared back at Julian Thorne. "Tell them, Julian," I whispered into the microphone, the sound amplified to a terrifying volume. "Tell the investors that these children do not exist." Standing firmly at my side, Leo clutched a thick leather-bound folder with a gravity that belied his age. He did not fidget. He did not hide behind my skirts. He stood like a soldier on the front lines, staring directly at the man who had fathered him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, board members, and distinguished guests," I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating tension of the room. I placed a protective hand on Mira's shoulder. "Allow me to introduce you to Leo and Mira Thorne. Your CEO's children. The very same children he abandoned when he threw his pregnant wife out onto the street 6 years ago." Julian looked as though he had been struck physically. The blood drained from his face so completely that his skin took on the waxy, gray pallor of a corpse. He took a staggering step back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, but no sound came out. He stared at them with wide, terrified eyes, looking at them not as his offspring, but as apparitions sent from hell to drag him down. In the front row, the chairman of the Olympus Group, the man holding the keys to the $2 billion merger, shot to his feet. His face was purple with rage. He looked from the children to Julian, and then to the legal counsel sitting beside him, who was already frantically typing on a tablet. The merger required a clean slate, and Julian had just presented him with a muddy, chaotic mess. "And they are not just his children," I continued, taking the folder from Leo's hand and holding it up for the cameras. "They are the rightful heirs to this company. According to the original articles of incorporation that Julian signed 10 years ago but clearly forgot to read, there is a specific clause regarding succession. Clause 17. Section B states that in the event of the founder's absence or incapacity, 40% of the founding shares transfer immediately to the direct legal heirs." Julian tried to erase me to trigger that absence, but he forgot one thing. I am still here, and now. So are they. A collective gasp tore through the room. 40%. That was controlling interest. That was the empire. That is a lie. Julian finally found his voice, though it was high and cracked with panic. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is lying. I did not know. She hid them from me. I had no idea she was pregnant when we divorced." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that did not reach my eyes. "I thought you might say that." I pressed the remote again. The screen behind me shifted. A blown-up image of a text message thread appeared, dated 2 weeks after our divorce. Subject: medical update. Sender: Ilara. Message: Julian. "I need to talk to you. The doctor says it is twins. Please. We need to discuss support. Response from Julian Thorne." Message: "I do not care if it is a whole football team. Get rid of it. You are not my problem anymore. Contact me again, and I will ruin you." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Julian stared at the screen. the evidence of his cruelty looming 20 feet tall behind him. He had thought that phone was destroyed, that the data was gone, but he forgot that I built the cloud architecture he used to back up his life. "You claimed in your IPO filing last year that you had no dependents," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "You signed a federal document under oath stating you had no heirs. That is securities fraud, Julian. That is a federal crime punishable by up to 20 years in prison." The reality of the situation crashed down on the stage. Sienna, who had been trying to compose herself on the floor, let out a screech of pure, unadulterated fury. "You told me she was barren," Sienna screamed, scrambling to her feet and lunging at Julian, her fingernails raking for his face. "You told me you had no baggage, you liar! You have ruined everything!" Security guards rushed to the stage, trying to pull the hysterical woman off the CEO, but the damage was done. The chaos was absolute. Flashbulbs erupted like a lightning storm, blinding and relentless. Behind me, the screen shifted one last time. It was now displaying a live feed of the stock market. The ticker symbol for Vanguard Innovations was flashing red. The line on the graph was not just dipping, it was diving vertically. "Look at the screen." "Julian," I said, pointing to the plummeting numbers. "That is the sound of your world shattering. In the last 3 minutes, your stock has dropped 60%. The investors are dumping everything. Your merger is dead. Your reputation is dead. And your company." I looked down at Leo and Mira, who were watching the destruction of their father's legacy with calm, gray eyes. "Your company belongs to us now." The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom did not just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the hinges. A dozen figures strode into the room, their movements synchronized and grim. They were not hotel security. They wore the navy blue windbreakers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by sharp-suited agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I had sent the dossier to them exactly 1 hour before the gala began. The jazz band had long since stopped playing, but the silence that fell over the room now was different. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. The lead agent, a tall woman with a face like carved granite, marched straight up the stairs to the stage. She ignored Sienna, who was sobbing into her hands, and stopped directly in front of Julian. "Julian Thorne," she said, her voice projecting clearly without a microphone. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest." Julian blinked, his face a mask of disbelief. He tried to straighten his jacket, a pathetic attempt to regain the dignity he had lost minutes ago. "Arrest. That is ridiculous. Do you know who I am? I am the CEO of Vanguard Innovations. You cannot just walk in here and—" "You are under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement of corporate funds, and filing false statements to federal regulators," the agent interrupted, pulling a pair of metal handcuffs from her belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "No," Julian shouted, backing away until he bumped into the podium. "I am in the middle of a merger. This is a misunderstanding. I want my lawyer. Get me my lawyer." 2 officers moved in, grabbing his arms. Julian struggled, his composure fracturing completely. He twisted in their grip, his eyes wild and desperate, scanning the room for a lifeline. His gaze landed on me. "Ilara," he screamed, the arrogance gone, replaced by a pathetic pleading. "Ilara, tell them this is a mistake. You can stop this. We can make a deal. I will give you half of everything." I stood motionless, my face a perfect, unyielding mask. I did not blink, seeing that bribery would not work. Julian tried the last card he had left. He looked down at the children. He lunged forward, dragging the officers with him, reaching out a shaking hand toward Mira. "Mira." "Sweetheart," he gasped, his voice cracking. "I am your daddy. Please. Tell your mother, Ilara, for the children, do not let them see their father taken away like this." His fingers were inches from Mira's arm. I tensed, ready to step in, but I did not need to. Mira took a deliberate step back. She did not hide behind me. She looked up at the weeping, sweating man in front of her with the cold, analytical gaze of a judge handing down a sentence. "You are not my father," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the chaos. My father would never make Mommy cry. Julian recoiled as if she had slapped him. The fight went out of him. He slumped in the officer's grip, a broken man. "And you," another agent said, stepping toward Sienna. "Sienna Blair. You are named as a co-conspirator in the embezzlement scheme." Sienna looked up, her mascara running in black streaks down her face. Panic seized her. She scrambled backward, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. "No, no!" It was him, she shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical. "He made me do it. I just signed the papers. He promised me marriage. He promised me protection. He is the liar. Look at him. He lied to everyone." She clawed at Julian's suit as the agents grabbed her, ripping the expensive fabric of his jacket. They were dragged away together, a screaming, weeping mess of broken ambition and greed. The flashbulbs from the press pit erupted into a blinding stroboscope lightning storm. Every moment of their disgrace was being captured, live-streamed to millions of viewers around the world. I watched Julian being led down the stairs, his head hung low, the handcuffs glinting under the harsh lights. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes filled with regret. But I offered him nothing, no pity, no anger, just nothing. As the doors closed behind the police escort, a strange thing happened. The crowd, the same people who had laughed at Julian's jokes about me, the same socialites who had whispered that I was crazy, began to clap. One person started, then another, until the entire ballroom was on its feet, offering a thunderous ovation. They cheered for the drama. They cheered for the winner. They cheered because they were relieved it was not them being dragged away. I looked out at the sea of applauding hypocrites. Their admiration meant less to me than the dust on the floor. I did not bow. I did not smile. I crouched down and wrapped my arms around Leo and Mira, pulling them close to my chest. They buried their faces in my neck, finally letting go of their brave facades. "It is okay," I whispered into their hair, ignoring the roar of the crowd and the flashing cameras. "It is done. We are free." The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the wooden block was infinitely more satisfying than the applause at the gala. Julian was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. His defense crumbled the moment the DNA results were entered into evidence, and the jury did not take kindly to a man who would erase his own children for a profit margin. As for Vanguard Innovations, the stock market did exactly what I predicted. It flatlined. I bought the controlling stake of the ruined company for pennies on the dollar, not to save it, but to bury it. I did not step back into the CEO office to relive the past. I had no interest in sitting on a throne built on lies. Instead, I liquidated the assets, sold the gleaming glass office buildings, and used the capital to launch the Phoenix Initiative, a venture capital fund exclusively for female entrepreneurs who have been told they are too emotional to lead a business. Sienna Blair avoided prison time by turning state's evidence and testifying against Julian, but she lost everything else. Bankrupt and blacklisted from every major corporation in the city. She fled New York with nothing but 2 suitcases. The last I heard, she was working as a waitress in a small town in Ohio, hiding her face whenever someone looked at her too long, terrified of being recognized as the woman who fell off the stage. Now, 3 years later, the air smells like salt and jasmine instead of fear. I sat on the terrace of my villa in Malibu, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. Down on the beach, Leo and Mira were building a massive sandcastle, their laughter carrying over the sound of the crashing waves. They do not ask about their father anymore. They are too busy being happy. I looked down at the letter in my hand. It arrived this morning, plain and white, stamped with the official seal of the Department of Corrections. It was thick, likely filled with pages of excuses and pleas. I could imagine his handwriting, shaky and desperate, trying to manipulate me one last time. "Ilara, please let me see them. I have changed," is probably what it said. I stood up and walked to the outdoor fireplace where a small fire was crackling against the ocean breeze. I did not open the envelope. I did not hesitate. I tossed the letter onto the burning logs. The paper curled and blackened instantly, the flames licking at his name until it turned to ash and floated up into the evening sky. I realized then that the sweetest revenge was not seeing him in handcuffs. It was standing here, in a house he could never enter, living a life he could never touch. I turned to look directly at you, breaking the invisible wall between my world and yours. I smiled, and this time it was a smile of pure, unburdened freedom. Never invite the past to your future party if you have not cleaned the skeletons out of the closet. And remember to comment number 1 if you think he deserved it. The screen fades to black as the sun sets over the ocean, framing a perfect picture of a mother and her 2 children. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment down below where you are listening from. I would love to connect with you all. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so this story can reach even more people.